Our final session of the day is our VC panel, and I would like to introduce the moderator who will introduce the panelists. Shahin Farshchi is an electrical engineer. He did his PhD in brain-computer interfaces, and he's a partner at Lux Capital. He's a very thoughtful investor in this space, and I want to personally thank him for actually driving the development of this panel. So welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. I'd like to invite my fellow panelists, Juan-Pablo and Ambar. Maybe I'll sit at the end here and I'll let you guys.
Hey, Amber. How you doing?
So really excited to be here today. We had a lot of great speakers so far. My name is Shahin. I'm a partner at a venture capital firm called Lux. We invest in frontier tech companies that are revolutionizing everything from tech to healthcare. We've been around for 15 years, and we've invested in over 100 companies. More importantly, I'd love the fellow panelists to introduce themselves, old friends, also investors in the healthcare space. I'll let them introduce each other, themselves. So maybe Ambar, you can start.
I was hoping you'd introduce me. That'll be more fun. My name is Ambar Battacharyya. I work at Maverick Ventures. Maverick, we have two sides to our platform. One is a hedge fund. It's about $10 billion. It's been around for 25 years. And two is a $400 million venture capital fund that we spun out of the hedge fund a couple of years ago. We're focused in both healthcare and technology. Half the fund is dedicated towards healthcare, and particularly at the intersection of both healthcare and technology. So areas like neurotechnology and neuroscience are fascinating to us. By background, my dad is a neurologist. I spent a lot of time thinking about neurology growing up. Was a kid and worked in his practice, so did a lot of the admin there, but picked up a bit of the science. My thesis in undergrad was on cognitive neuroscience, and have been spent a lot of time actually looking for investment opportunities in this space. Can talk through some of that search and how we think about that criteria later as we go.
Juan-Pablo.
Yeah, so my name is Juan-Pablo Mas. I work at a fund called Action Potential Venture Capital, which is a subsidiary of GSK, the pharma company, GlaxoSmithKline. We are the second venture capital fund at GSK. The one that's been there for over 30 years is SR1, focused entirely on biopharmaceutical investing. Action Potential was created at the time when GSK, about 4.5 years ago, decided they wanted to get into a realm of neuromodulation, what has been coined electroceuticals or bioelectronic medicines, and initiated an internal effort to develop those, as well as a venture fund, which is Action Potential. The internal effort was spun out about a year ago, actually a year and a half ago, to form a new co called Galvani, which was half funded by Google Wearable and half by GSK. And Action Potential remains at GSK as an evergreen fund and focused again entirely on neuromodulation, predominantly for therapeutic benefit. Briefly, I guess for background's sake, electrical engineering, studied at Stanford actually, and did some work in neuroscience collaboratively with Bill Newsom's lab, and also in the neurology department, pediatric movement disorders lab when Terry Sanger was still here. He's now moved to Southern California, but historically had that interest, went to medical devices and worked as an engineer before getting into venture through the business school here.
Awesome. I'm the least interesting person on the panel. Grew up here, did undergrad at Berkeley ECS, went to GM briefly, learned I guess the hard way that I don't want to work for a big company in the Midwest. Came back to California, did a PhD in electrical engineering, as Lisa alluded to. Did low power integrated circuits for implanted brain recording systems. Started a company around that unsuccessfully, learned the hard way again that it's one thing to have a great little widget, another to have a viable business. I had the former, not the latter. Got to know a bunch of VCs in the process, and Lux asked if I'd be interested in trying being a VC, and here I am. 12 years later, so I've had some staying power. TBD if I can actually become a good VC. And so I was told that the audience is going to be a split between founders, academics, and big company folks. Did I miss anybody? And investors, of course. Least interesting folks.
You want to do a show of hands?
Yes, show of hands. How many founders do we have in the audience? Okay, good portion. How many scientists and academics? Pure scientists. Okay, good split. So it's almost 50-50. And how many big company people checking out, looking for the next big thing? Okay, good. Anybody I miss? Investors. Okay, good. Awesome. Some investor representation. Fantastic. So, and then we have also obviously, the government here as well. So you cannot include the government. So it's really important for a lot of folks to understand, what VCs are excited about nowadays. And it's really, if you look at a VC's portfolio, it represents what they've been interested in the past. So it's kind of a trailing indicator, but it's not an indicator of what they're looking for in the future. So when a founder comes to me and says, hey, I see that you did X, Y, and Z, I have something that's an interesting new spin on that. It's probably less interesting than an entrepreneur that comes through the door and tells me about something that I haven't heard about and gets me excited about that. So maybe you guys can talk about what you've done in the past at your firms related to the space, and kind of what's exciting, what you're intellectually curious about moving forward. Maybe Juan-Pablo, you can start.
Sure. So let's see. In my previous firm, Morgan Thaler Ventures, which became Lightstone Ventures, some of the most exciting companies I was involved with that essentially had a neural mechanism of action, were therapeutic medical devices with a neural mechanism of action for hypertension, for COPD, for rheumatoid arthritis, 3 different companies that effectively were taking devices into billion-dollar drug markets. So that was a theme that has always resonated with me, both from an investor perspective, given the potential market opportunity, as well as from a scientific perspective. And so action potential, we've made about 8 investments in the last 3.5 years. I just came this morning from a board meeting in Southern California of a company called SetPoint Medical, which is the one focused on initially rheumatoid arthritis, but also inflammatory diseases like Crohn's and multiple sclerosis via vagus nerve stimulation. So a novel approach using a inflammatory reflex to modulate the spleen and the production of inflammatory cytokines and T-cell behavior. So that's a pretty interesting space that we've been involved in. Others that are more technology focused for existing indications are companies like Saluda Medical, which is a spinal cord stimulator that uses evoked compound action potentials in real time in a closed loop fashion to modulate the stimulation parameters to get better clinical outcomes. And that's not a very new indication. Lower back pain, spinal cord stimulators have existed for quite some time, but the technological advances there could very well translate to other applications, other nerves in the body, where that not relying on a biomarker or a clinical endpoint to tell you if the device is optimized, but actually getting real-time feedback from the nerves themselves is quite interesting. And there's a host of other things. We've funded a couple Stanford biodesign students as well in different companies. Some with Cala Health is one that has a wearable device for the treatment of initially movement disorders, but a variety of other applications as well. So yeah, I could spend more time there, but I'll,
And what's exciting you? What are you curious about moving forward?
I continue to really get most passionate about when an entrepreneur comes to our offices and finds us with a new physiological insight. So if a nerve that has the capabilities of treating some condition that nobody had previously considered, and has, especially if that condition or disease has a way of, in near-term clinical trials, the ability to sort of validate that hypothesis. Those are quite interesting. Again, of course, if it's a very underserved market and there are patients where perhaps the safety profile of neuromodulation has an advantage over systemically delivered molecular medicines, those are quite interesting to us. So, if you're hearing any of those, or if anyone in the audience has any of those, please come to us. But technical advances, technological advances, that can change the game and disrupt an existing market as well are themes we like.
Cool. Ambar?
Yeah, hard to disagree with any of that. I'll say for us, we've over time we've looked at three, and both at my former venture fund as well. Looked at Neuro in three key areas. But I think we looked at it similar to you. I think in the context of the therapeutic landscape as well, right? It's hard to look at just neuromodulation. I think as you'd agree, as the end all and be all. I think if you look at different pharmacological approaches too. But with that said, I think the three big areas we've looked at. One is kind of new use cases for DBS, right? What can be done? It's been tried and true for a long time. Are there different applications for it? And so we've spent some time looking at that, and I think you have as well. Two is we've, in the broad landscape of neuro, and this kind of boils into therapeutics too, but Parkinson's, ALS, Alzheimer's, these are still untreatable and by many and all means. We've seen mostly therapeutic approaches here to date, some of which have actually gotten a lot more positive data in the early stages than I think ever before. We are looking for kind of neuromodulated approaches to these diseases too. We think that's one of the few remaining $10 billion plus annual categories left in pharma that is greenfield. And so we've invested a ton of time and resources towards hoping we can find a best-in-class solution there. And then three, and this will sound a little far-fetched, but I think I'll explain a few examples. But I'll call them they're more not disease-related, but they're more kind of human performance optimization related. And so these are companies that can help an athlete perform better before a major race or performance, or help a student, concentrate more, things of that sort. So still with an FDA process, still, needing strong clinical data, but the business models are a little bit different. They might be cash pay versus insurance pay. They might have a centralized lab that you go to. And that might be on the bleeding edge of what might interest consumers in certain niche things. And when we look at other things like a Fitbit or others that have turned into billion-dollar companies, I think they started with certain niches too, and those niches actually turned into mass markets. And so that one's probably a little less, kind of therapeutic focused than others, but I think there's a real market opportunity there too.
So we're very similar. We've funded a bunch of therapeutics companies, but not necessarily using neurostim or DBS. We have one company called Cala, which Juan-Pablo alluded to, where we're co-investors, which is using transdermal electric nerve stimulation to address ET and potentially other ailments. And then we have Halo Neuro, which Ambar was alluding to, which is using TDCS, transdermal direct current stimulation, to increase mental acuity to help with improving training and ultimately human performance. That's not to say that we're done with those areas. We're obviously very excited about funding other efforts broadly in both the therapeutics and kind of like the consumer kind of product spaces as well. But I think it would be a good segue into going after or talking about specific criteria. So Juan-Pablo, you and I had a conversation, in fact, at Justin's event a few weeks back. We were talking about specific criteria as it relates to the nature of clinical trials that these companies need to go through, and what, I wouldn't say shortcuts, but what would make life a lot easier, especially for a venture-backed company that has very expensive capital taking it through trials. What would your advice be to those companies?
Yeah, well, we definitely value clinical data and the scientific understanding of the therapy and IP heavily in our types of investments. So the quicker a company can get to validating their new physiological insight and doing so clinically on small dollars in a short period of time, that's only going to help that company raise funds and also establish some important IP positions. Sometimes that is a surgical intervention that has nothing, there is no product developed per se, but you can piggyback onto an existing surgical case if it's IRB approved and ethical and all the rest. But you can get a really nice answer to questions, particularly those that can be measured on the table and in a short period of time. That's one way of doing so. I think another way in which we look at these products is certainly from a business model perspective. It's easy to say, well, if something is not implanted, it's externally delivered, then that's only, particularly if it's 510K regulatory path, that's an advantage. And it is to getting to market earlier, certainly to enrolling patients and funding a study earlier and learning if you've really cracked the code. But it's typically a very different business model depending on what if you're looking for FDA approval on a particular claim language or indication of use. And so I think companies really do need to think about product market fit, which is a general term, thrown around loosely, but it matters when, to take it especially from a founder or scientist who identifies an opportunity and learns of an application and has the natural inclination to just want to run with that, to think through certainly how, what is the patient's, inclination to adopt this technology, especially if it requires some level of compliance or daily use or constant wearing. What is a payer's inclination from an insurance company perspective or CMS to pay for that, or whether or not the patient themselves is willing to pay for it out of pocket. Again, in the U.S., healthcare out of pocket pay is not something we're used to in most things. In certain areas like aesthetics and others, much more used to paying out of pocket for those things. And these are all dynamics that perhaps are not the most evident when the idea is so nascent, but have real lasting implications and matter a lot to investors and so on. So sometimes we, in fact, actually, if you look at some of the data out of Silicon Valley Bank and other places, some of the better financial returns for companies and investors have, in fact, been from some of the PMA devices that are active implants that do have longer clinical trial, timelines, but if you really invest in the science and the clinical data, can have the best returns over time, despite not being commercialized or revenue generating in the near term. So these are some of the considerations we think a lot about, when we're looking at new opportunities. Not sure if there are so many shortcuts.
Yeah, so I remember we had a conversation around that, and you touched on this earlier, just to echo what you were saying earlier, which is a device that's already been approved for a certain indication, and you are now trying to leverage the existing proof points as it relates to safety, but then going after a different indication. That's one comment that I heard earlier. The second that you just talked about was compliance, so something that patients generally are used to dealing with, so it's not a whole new behavior changing requirement. And also with the physicians, where the value proposition is better understood and more well known, so they're not taking a risk on this new product. So these are a lot of second and third order, I would say, issues that a lot of academics and engineers and kind of early founders don't think about that can be hugely impactful to the path for the path of the company moving forward. So Ambar, switching gears.
I'll just add on to that. I mean, I think when you look at the data, like the PMA companies do tend to have better returns, which flies in the face of the capital efficiency theory, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, if you have a kind of a lean and mean company, you do, class 2, and you get it through, you can get the market quick, right? But I think what you end up seeing in the market, in the venture landscape, at least for medtech, is that there's not that many investors, mm-hmm. Around the table who are willing to fund medtech companies, and so. And I think most of the people give the advice of, hey, be capital efficient. And so there's only a few brave souls that go out there with a pre-PMA idea and say, hey, I'm really sticking to this, right? And it's going to be really capital intensive. It's going to take some real trials here, and there's going to be some real FDA risk, and maybe some real market adoption risk relative to other things. But if you can get there, right, the returns are really nonlinear, right? I mean, that's the thing. But it's partly because there's less competition too, I think, right? Because very few people actually want to go down that path, which is a 7 to 10 year plus path with every 2 years, you're de-risk part of the business, but the main risks all remain ahead of you, right? And that's always been, I think, a bit of the challenge here. I don't know if you agree or not.
No, certainly. I think if you have a product that can get to market faster and provides a real service and people are willing to pay for it and use it, and so the market risks are lower, presumably, then there is no reason to take a harder path. You should go fund that company and go commercialize. And the dollars that it can take to achieve the revenue and the adoption that you hope to get are going to be less risky, right? Whereas, oftentimes we see companies that think the investor just wants the fastest path to market and a 510K approach, but is looking to sort of skimp on the evidence that they're willing to generate and forget that adoption in a clinical setting from physicians requires, historically has required just lots of, evidence to sort of promote the mass adoption. And so we typically are attracted to entrepreneurs that say, listen, we could just do this study and get to market, but instead we're going to do something more rigorous. And in fact, here's why, because this is what we're competing against. A good example is Set-Point Medical for rheumatoid arthritis. Rheumatologists are historically conservative and have a great set of options at their disposal today with biologics and other things to treat that disease. Unless you run a trial that has the ability to really change hearts and minds of rheumatologists to somehow get them to release their patients to surgery and to refer them on to a neurosurgeon where they don't historically have a referral path, you're going to have a hard time trying to pump money into the market to gain that adoption without the evidence you need to.
Exactly. I mean, I was on the board outside of Neuro, a company called Fractal Technologies, which you guys probably know, which surgical intervention to cure diabetes, right? 45-minute procedure, ablation-based, but it can reverse type 2 diabetes in 45 minutes. It's unbelievable. Clearly PMA, I mean, without any question. But the go-to-market question, right, is do you go to endocrinologists? You go to surgeons? You go to primary care? Like, who do you actually go to here, right? And 7 years into this company, that still remains a key go-to-market question. As we're in the middle of the PMA now, and then the question is then what, right? And so it's a real question.
It's taking a step back. I was just going to say it's inherent to neurotech. Frankly, I think the neurosurgeon or the neurologist does certain things today, but we're going to be asking them to be doing a whole lot more and talking to a whole different set of other specialties in order to treat patients in the future, and that's inherently market development.
Yep. So you talked about the PMA, the moonshots. So what gets you comfortable when folks come in and present a plan to you that in the back of your head is going to take $1 million, $100 million to get to market? What do you want to hear to get you comfortable with that plan?
Yeah, I think for me, it's three things. I think one is kind of the baseline of where the therapeutic approaches is either stagnant or there's no great innovation in the pipeline. Like when you look at it, right? And we talked about Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, some of these diseases where you look and there's some exciting things, but still it's pretty much. It's not like there's an IO therapy behind the corner, right, which might change the world. And so that's kind of baseline number one. Number two is there is a path towards getting that clinical data, right? For me, I like seeing animal data. I actually like seeing some of that being proven out before I invest. But I like being able to see that and a realistic path towards that. I think three, and this is the trickiest one, is from a regulatory perspective. The FDA has certainly become more stable in the last, from my assessment at least, in the last 4 to 5 years. If you rewind the clock 10 years ago, I think it was, in medtech, it was just moving goalposts all day long, where they said come back with X, and once you come back with X, they'd say, hey, I actually meant X plus 2, and it was really painful for a lot of investors and entrepreneurs.
Yeah, we've seen that.
But I think they've gotten better. But I think what we'd want to do, we like talking to folks who are in the regulatory consulting world and regulatory advisory world to understand where the FDA exactly is on these issues.
Yeah, no, I think, I guess two things. One is partly addressing a point you made earlier, Ambar, about the source of capital. One of the things that we do look for are companies that could, even if they are medical device in nature and from a regulatory path, but could be attractive to pharmaceutical companies.
Yep.
I think the tech companies are clearly coming to the table to invest, and in particular areas, some of which have been discussed in the last couple of days, may be acquirers as well. Certainly VR and AR and others, that's obvious. But what has been interesting for the companies we've invested in, though medical devices have been very hard to attract venture capital because they just haven't been there, those dollars, particularly early stage, they've been very competitive financings that we've been involved in, partly because there's a recognition now that within the medical device companies, neuromodulation remains one of the most strategic areas of growth, and so they're voting with their feet. Whether or not they acquire early, that's still probably too soon to say. But pharmaceutical companies, if the business model fits their commercial channel and their sales force skill set, and the wearables in particular and the external devices have, I think, resonate there with them. So companies that can attract financings from a broad set of investors, as well as multiple potential exit opportunities, are more interesting. And I lost my train of thought on the second point, but yeah.
We'll let you get back to it.
Sure.
So let's quickly talk about consumer neurotech. So completely different ballgame. Help me understand, and given how Maverick, I understand, does both health and just broadly technology investing. So when you look at a consumer-oriented, we're talking about increasing mental acuity, human performance. How do you look at those differently, if you look at those differently?
Yeah, and it's almost like a completely different framework added on top of the existing framework. And so here we've talked about many words, but none of them include the word revenue or COGS, or customer acquisition cost. The way that we think about consumer, broadly speaking, is there's two metrics that really matter. It's customer lifetime value, i.e. how much revenue, but really gross margin can you get from a customer over the course of before they churn. And then two is the customer acquisition cost. Like, what does it actually cost to acquire them? That could be via advertising online or commercials. That can be through Best Buy or the Apple Store, whatever it is. And in consumer, like those, you live and die off those metrics. And so consumer neurotech, I think, is no different. You need everything that we've been discussing here in terms of good clinical data. You need the FDA to either bless it or decide that it doesn't need any blessing or cursing of any sort. Really strong, at least really strong safety data. I mean, really, like that's the must here is, do no harm first when it comes to this stuff. But then on top of that, you need all the chops of real consumer e-commerce type companies, and those are the two metrics that matter the most. And
so it's twice as hard.
I think it's twice as hard. But could be much more capital efficient. I mean, very, very rarely are you doing a pre-PMA consumer company. Like, I don't think that in the 2x2 of innovation that is yet to exist as far as I know. But I think it's really intriguing, and I think the benefit here is if things can go viral within communities, your customer acquisition cost can be low, if not free. I think the benefits of these, there's a lot of PR that happens in and around the space, but I think people are very curious about how they can make this organ work better, or any of these organs actually, frankly, work better. And so I think there's a lot of potential there, but you need, as you think about building the team, I guess is probably the most applicable thing to the founders in the room. You not just need the skill set from the scientific perspective, but you need to find real people who've built consumer companies before to join full time and take that leap of faith, because it's a whole different muscle that you're flexing there.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think the people element and the sort of the phases of your company and the importance of different skill sets, especially if the business model requires it earlier, and you need to both convince yourselves and convince investors that that's a viable path. There's no replacing someone who's done it before and can bring that credibility and that experience. So,
agreed. Lisa, do we have time for questions? All right. I certainly have more questions after hearing all this wisdom, so I'm sure you guys do as well. Questions from the audience?
I have a lot from you about the therapeutic therapeutics, medical devices, that kind of thing. What do you think about predictive medicine, AI and that kind of things? How do you include these new trends moving fast in your strategy?
Just to repeat the question for the audience, so what are the panelists' thoughts on predictive medicine? So using deep nets and all the buzzwordy technologies we've heard about, at least recently, maybe even blockchain, as it relates to healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere. I think I'm very bullish on it, as kind of the short answer to the question. I think 3 to 5 years from now, I think the question will almost be like, how do you think about using computers to help you make a decision, right? And you're like, yeah, I'll probably use a computer to help me make a decision. I think it'll get to that point. What matters the most is workflows, and making sure to actually, go through it.
If it fits an existing workflow,
then it's better, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think radiology is what people think about as the testing ground for a lot of kind of ground zero AI in healthcare. I would agree with that. Pathology, I think, is not far behind. But we'll see more and more of it. We're seeing it in drug discovery already. Actually, my last meeting right before this was actually an AI blockchain company. But what they're doing is they're incorporating genomic data, pharmaceutical data, pictures, of your medicine cabinet, your Facebook, Twitter feeds, all of it into one to make kind of precision medicine diagnosis. And then somehow they've converted that to storing it on a blockchain, and they've already had an ICO. I don't know how that all happened in the last 12 months, but
wow.
it did. So it's real, and there's gonna be a lot of noise, but there's gonna be some real value added here as it relates to precision medicine, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo the piece about fitting into existing workflows and thinking about I think it's the analog that I sometimes go to is sort of anything in AI and others requires big data sets, presumably, or at least access to the right data. What did Google and Facebook do to become data companies? And that was undeniably offer a service that drew a lot of people to it and repeatedly drew them to it and created valuable data. And then they found different business models to build and sources of revenue to build on top of that. And I think the same applies in healthcare. Even if your solution or your company is serving, has the potential to do a lot once it obtains the data, don't skip past the how do I get that data and how do I make it proprietary to my company. And so you need to understand the workings of the healthcare system, or if it's not a healthcare product, it's a consumer product, certainly something that will attract customers to you, whether or not you're charging or not for that service. But you get that data and it's yours and it's proprietary, and you have a business model that works in the early phase of your company that you could then leverage and create, you may evolve over time. Yeah. But I sometimes, and that's easier to do, I think, in consumer, because we're all consumers and we can kind of look around and ask people enough, what would you do? What would you pay for? Or if it's a B2B, you'd ask the right companies, what is it that you would need and what can we serve you with? It's harder in healthcare because it's for all the obvious reasons, so I think, but it's equally as important to crack that nut first.
Do we have time for more questions?
We really don't, but I'm wondering if you could, because it's the end of the day, I'm wondering if you could stay around for the next question.
I would be happy to stick around and answer questions, although hopefully you guys would.
Yeah,
fantastic.
briefly, yeah.
So great. Thank you to our panelists. You guys did a fantastic job. And
Thank you.
We'll be around.